So today we are going to discuss issues to do with interventional studies. Interventional studies are actually very important in health because uh, we use them to determine uh, which drug is effective for treating a particular condition. So we can use interventional studies to do uh, a comparison for different treatments, or even when you are developing new vaccines, new drugs, we use interventional studies. So in this presentation, we are going to look at the pertinent issues that you should be aware of when designing and implementing an interventional study. Interventional studies can actually be called as experimental studies. So in this presentation, I'll be using either interventional studies or uh, experimental studies. These are basically the same, they mean the same thing. So in our broad categorization of research designs, we can have two major broad categories. That is interventional studies and observational studies. The observational studies can also be termed as non-interventional studies or non-experimental studies. When we talk about interventional studies, we mean that we are having a study in which the researcher is going to manipulate a group of research participants. So he's going to give a particular treatment to a particular group of participants and then compare that group with a group which has not received the treatment or the intervention. So when you have these two groups, that is when we can now determine the impact of the treatment or the intervention on a particular group. That is the target, what we call the interventional group or the treatment group. Okay, so that is basically the purpose of an interventional studies. The interventional studies allow us to make a comparison between two interventions, which can either be drugs, vaccines, or a population-based intervention, and see whether that intervention actually works, effectiveness, whether it is actually more safe, is it more effective, is it feasible to use that intervention to address a particular health problem. We can categorize interventional studies into three: randomized controlled trials, which we often refer to as RCTs, and then the non-randomized interventional studies, and then the hybrid study designs. We'll look at each of those. When we talk about randomized control studies, we refer to those where the researcher assigns the group of participants to either the intervention group or the control group. Okay, the control group are those that do not get the treatment, okay, or are those that get the placebo, okay, and then the intervention group are those that will receive treatment or a particular intervention. And that assignment to either the control group or the intervention group is actually a random process. This is to make sure that we eliminate selection bias, such that at the start of the intervention, everyone has an equal chance of being either in the control group or in the intervention group. So we use randomization to do that. So that's why we call them randomized control trials, because the assignment to either of the groups is a random process where each one of the participants has an equal chance to either be in the intervention group or the control group. In practice, this actually, the randomized control trials produce strong evidence for whether a particular intervention actually causes a particular impact or effect. Okay? Now, when we have the non-randomized interventional studies, we are not randomly assigning the participants to either of the group. This could be because of practical reasons or even ethical reasons, and we decide to say no. You go to the intervention group, you are going to the control group without making the process a random one. So of course that one comes with selection bias, but because of issues to do with practicability and ethical issues, we can use the non-randomized intervention studies. Then the last type of interventional study design is the hybrid study design. With this, you have a combination of randomized controlled trials and also the non-randomized interventional studies. So you have a mix. So that means that you're getting the benefits of both designs. And it happens when you actually think this is the applicable approach to use in investigating a particular problem. It is often very difficult to always conduct interventional studies because of the costs associated, the ethical issues associated, and how rigorous the process is. So in public health, majorly, most of the studies done are observational in nature. But there are occasions which actually warrant interventional studies. And those occasions are when there is no any other appropriate study design. Then we have the interventional study to choose from. What also has to be taken into consideration is that when you have started the interventional study, then it is actually very important that you have a guide on how the research will go on, looking at the compliance with the regulatory authorities, compliance with the ethical matters, and also monitoring if actually it is actually worthy investigating that problem further. So you need to have a system in place that checks and monitors whether the interventional study is actually going on in the right direction, or there is need to change the approach, or there is need to even end the study. Data that comes from interventional studies is very key. And therefore, it should actually be kept, okay, or managed properly. Issues of privacy, issues of confidentiality, these are very pertinent in interventional studies. It is very important that the researcher or even the research team have very good procedures on how to maintain quality data and how that data will be stored, kept, analyzed, and all the data management principles have to be followed. And then, of course, lastly, interventional studies may actually cause harm to the research subjects. And therefore, it is very important to adhere to the regulatory guidelines or even the ethical principles of research. So these have to be put into consideration. The other very important aspect is if there is a problem or a health problem that you want to investigate, you need to make sure that you investigate it in the right sample. So you need to determine which population is appropriate for you to include in the study. Because in the end, you need to be able to recruit people or participants in the rightful group such that you can be able to assess the outcome properly. So you need to have an inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is to say that you need to have a proper guideline on who is eligible to be in the study and who cannot be in the study, which is now the exclusion criteria. So after deciding who will be in the study, that is the population study, then you need to decide on how many of those members who are eligible are you going to put into your study. And that is to do with the sample size. You cannot investigate a particular health problem in everyone in a given population. Not everyone can be included in a study. So you need to get a proportion of the people from the eligible population. So you need to determine how many of them you need. The determination of the sample size is very important because it allows you to eliminate issues to do with bias because of the sample size and the failure to make generalization because of the sample size. So you look at sample size as one that can allow you to achieve the level of precision that you want and the level of statistical power that you want. So if you have looked at the people who are eligible to participate into the given study, in this case, the interventional study, you need to talk to them and enroll them into the study. And to do this, you may have to look for them from where they are. So you can do some advertising and recruit people using different channels of communication. Or people can hear through the word of mouth, or the one who has participated in the study can also refer others to become a research participant. Now, when you are now conducting a study, it's very important that you collect the appropriate data that will make you come up with the right conclusions about what you're investigating. So that means that you need to use the right data collection tools, to be able to make conclusions, the appropriate conclusions. So you can use questionnaires, you can use observations, electronic health records, you can use self-administered questionnaires, you can do interviews with the participants. All this, you can choose the tool that is appropriate for the study that you're conducting. So this data has to be kept and managed well, such that the output after analysis is logical and can make some sound conclusions. People can make conclusions about the data. There are a lot of considerations that you need to put in mind when dealing with data quality. It's very important that the data is validated. That means that you really need to check this data entirely as you enter it into a database. Okay, whatever software that you use for analysis, as you enter this data, or even after entering it, you look through this data and see that the data is accurate and is actually consistent. When you find errors, then you need to remove those errors. Okay, you need to correct those errors. When you do that, that is what we call data cleaning. Usually, when collecting data in an interventional study, you don't collect data at once. You can collect data over a given period of time. So it is very important for you to keep monitoring the quality of data that is always being entered into the study database. A data auditing is when you get an independent team of reviewers to look at the data and see whether it is actually accurate or complete. This helps when there could be issues to do with conflict of interest or even bias issues. Sometimes you can make changes to the data after realizing an error. But even in the future, you may want to interest yourself in what changes did you make to the data over time. That means that if you make any changes on the data, there should be a record of that change that you made and when you made it. This is very important, and that is what we call data version control. Data may be lost, so you might need to have a backup and recovery system such that if you get your data, if you lose your data, you are in position to recover it. So you can have a data recovery software to be able to recover any data that might have been lost accidentally or even through data theft. Data security is very important because you don't want people to access people's private information. Okay, so you need to make sure that you have your data kept in a secure location, and also no third parties have access to this data. So that means that you may need to use firewalls, password protected devices, and other things that make sure that no one has unauthorized access to this data. You need to have a data management plan that is actually well documented. This guides on the process of collecting data and actually managing it. It acts as a guide to make sure that everyone is actually following it within the research team. And then lastly, we look at data sharing policy. This is very important to have for an interventional study because there should be levels of authorizations to given data sets. Who has authorization to share data and who could actually have access to this data via sharing. This is also very important. When collecting data, the things that you should keep in mind are that the people that you're going to collect the data from should have signed the informed consent, and that you have good procedures to protect their privacy and confidentiality, and that you actually don't collect data at the expense of the patient's right or the participant's right and their welfare. So how do you ensure that privacy and confidentiality are maintained? When you're going to collect data or recruit people into a particular study, you need to obtain informed consent from them. This means that you inform them of the benefits and the risks and the potential harm that they may get. And then they make a voluntary decision whether to participate or even to withdraw their participation at any level of the study. You don't want the names and addresses and other identifying information about the participants being easily displayed or being easily traced. So you may consider making them anonymous. So you anonymize the data by removing any personal identification information. Sometimes you may have to encrypt sensitive data such that if perhaps by any way there is access, then that access is restricted because the data is encrypted. The data should be stored in a secure location. You should have written protocols and guidelines that promotes data security, and regularly back up your data in case you lose it, so that you can recover it. If the data has been used for the study and is no longer needed, then it is very prudent that the data is destroyed. Different organizations have different data protection requirements, and you should comply with those requirements. It's also very important to continuously educate research staff and students on the importance of the data privacy and confidentiality, and how they can actually maintain privacy and confidentiality. So you need to have mechanisms that actually address issues to do with how the interventional study is going on. So you need to have interventional monitoring strategies. This is to detect whether it is meaningful to continue with the study, or the study actually needs to be stopped for the benefit of the participants. So there should be a system of monitoring closely whether the intended goal of the intervention is being achieved. So when preparing an interventional study, you need to have tools that you use to make sure that the study actually goes on well. You need to have the trained staff. You need to have different tools to continuously guide the study. You need to have manuals, protocols, and guidelines for the interventional study. The outcome assessment is a concept that actually at the end, during or at the start of the intervention, there's something that you are testing, whether you have drug A and drug B, and you want to see how drug A influences blood pressure and how drug B influences blood pressure. So the outcome that you are assessing is actually the blood pressure in this case, which is a physiological measure, and it's an example of an outcome assessment that you can do in an interventional study. So you need to look at these parameters. You need to clearly state the outcome measures that you're dealing with, whether they're primary or even secondary. So now when you have this data, you need to analyze this data. You can use a statistical software to do this analysis. And there are different statistical procedures that you can follow. And you can also use different types of statistics to make meaning out of the data that you collect. Descriptive data allows us to describe the events or particular conditions. So descriptive studies tell us issues to do with the mean, the average, the mode, and the things like that. Whereas inferential statistics help us to make judgments on the relationship between the intervention or the cause and the outcomes, whether the effect is because of the intervention. And then regression analysis can also be used to test hypotheses that we usually form at the start of the intervention study. Usually what happens is that you make a statement which we call hypothesis, which is basically a statement um, that, for example, drug X is more effective in managing a condition Y than drug Z. Okay, this is an example of a theoretical hypothesis that you can make at the beginning of an interventional study. So at the end of the interventional study, you have to test whether it is actually true that the drug that you say is better than the other in managing a particular condition. Usually challenges that we encounter in interventional studies are issues to do with bias and confounding factors. This usually cause problems in us making conclusions about particular interventional studies. And when we talk about bias, we are meaning that there are systematic errors that happen because of influence of other factors. Whereas the confounding factors are those that are not under investigation, but they have an influence on the results that we are actually investigating. We can use the approach of blinding to manage some of these biases that we may have in interventional studies. So if we don't know whether a group of individuals are either receiving the drug of interest or not receiving the drug of interest, or they are perhaps receiving a placebo. If we do that, if we don't know, or even the participants actually don't know what they are receiving, then that is a concept to do with blinding. This is very important because it eliminates an issue to do with participants behaving in a particular way because they know that they are receiving a particular treatment. So we don't want them to influence our conclusions by way of their behavior. Okay, so it eliminates the beliefs that participants may have on whether they are receiving a treatment or not. We have three types of blinding. That is, single blind is when the participants are unaware, but the researchers are aware. Double blind is when both the researchers and the participants are unaware of which group is actually receiving the intervention of interest. And then the triple blind is when the participant, the researchers, and those who are assessing the outcome actually are unaware of the intervention the participant are receiving. Randomization, as we said, is a process where we randomly assign individuals to either the treatment or the control groups. The process should be one where each member of either group has equal chances of being in either of the groups. This is very important because it eliminates selection bias. So randomization can be done in a variety of ways. You can have what you call simple randomization, stratified randomization, and then minimization. These are all different strategies that you can use in randomization. The control group, like we said earlier on, are those that will receive the treatment or the placebo. And then the outcome measures are the variables that we use to determine whether the intervention is having an effect or not. Power analysis in relation to power size, in relation to sample size, is when determining the sample size. If you have a sample size which is small, it is very difficult to reach what we call power analysis. When you're done with the data collection and analysis, you can now disseminate your study report through academic journals, conferences, or even share your report with key stakeholders. In summary, we have realized that interventional studies actually give us very good evidence, but they also come with their own challenges in conducting them or implementing them. It's very vital that researchers maintain strict research protocols in order to adhere to them and ethical issues that arise from intervention.